The parents held this little baby for about an hour. They cuddled the baby, they held her. But then at some point after that first 60 minutes, the chain of custody was lost. And this unnamed baby was found some hours later lying in a medical waste bin, whimpering and struggling to breathe. And no one even knows how long that baby was there, but one baby survived for 24 hours after their abortion.
That's insane. No. How is that happening in Australia?
And
That's insane.
how is no one talking about it?
Okay, Dr. Joanna Howe, thanks for making the time.
Thank you.
Today, we are tackling one of the most complex and emotionally charged issues of our time, which is abortion. It's a topic that can divide a room in seconds, sparking fierce debate and a deep conviction in everyone. But what if, instead of shouting past each other, we took a deep breath and listened? What if, rather than entrenching ourselves in opposition, we built a bridge of understanding? That's the mission today. And no matter where people stand, whether they are staunchly pro-life or a full abortion supporter, or if they're still grappling with the issue, one thing is for certain. What we're about to expose in this episode will shock everyone to their core. Dr. Joanna Howe, you're an Australian lawyer and academic, and you've zeroed in on a chilling, underreported reality, which you're going to be blowing the whistle on in this episode. Could you sum up what it is we're about to dive into and why this is such a big scandal?
This is the biggest medical scandal in Australia today. Doctors perform it, nurses do it, nobody wants to talk about it, and it's all happening behind closed doors, and the victims themselves cannot speak up. It's the leading cause of death in Australia. But what we're going to expose today will shock people because the media doesn't report it. Midwives and nurses are traumatised, often in tears, dealing with this in the day-to-day. They can't talk about it. They'll get fired if they talk about it. And nobody knows this is going on. There's millions of dollars behind it. There's this interweb between academia, corporates, government and business. And the general public are left clueless.
So what exactly is this medical scandal? Can you elaborate? Can you summarise what's going on?
I think most people are aware that abortions happen in our country, but what I reckon 99% of Australians do not know is that there are circumstances where babies will survive their abortion, so they'll be born alive, and then they're left to die without a legal right to care, and that's happening at least once a week, every week in our country. I didn't know this when I first started speaking out about abortion in 2019. I started looking at the health reports in the very few states that release them. So there is actually a massive cover-up. Most Australian states do not release public data on abortion. There's such a woeful lack of information. But in Queensland and Victoria, they do. They've got annual health reports produced by their departments. Now, they don't list it as a line item, babies born alive and left to die. What they do is have a line item about termination of pregnancy, perinatal deaths from termination of pregnancy. And they've got two columns. One is stillbirth and the other is neonatal death. The stillbirth column indicates the babies who, what has happened with a late-term abortion is the mother has been put under sedation or anaesthesia, and they've injected the baby's heart, the left ventricle of her heart, with potassium chloride or digoxin. That's a poison. They do this to animals when they want to put them down. They do it to killers on death row. But with animals and killers on death row, you get sedated first, you get pain relief first. That doesn't happen to the fetus, to the baby in utero. And we're talking about babies that are older than 22 weeks and up until birth. So they get injected with this poisonous substance. Then the mother's given labour-inducing drugs, because once the baby's been injected, it brings on a painful cardiac arrest, but they do usually die. And then labour-inducing drugs, and the mother delivers the baby vaginally whole. So she delivers a stillborn baby. So if you look at the health reports, it indicates how many babies have been killed late in pregnancy in Queensland and Victoria through a stillbirth. But then there's this other column. There's a column that says neonatal death. When I was combing through the data, I didn't know what that meant and it didn't make sense to me. So I started asking questions you're not meant to ask. But I started asking questions and kept asking them until I got an answer. And what it was confirmed was that a neonatal death is that the baby has breathed, they've survived the abortion, they've exited the birth canal with signs of life. So they're alive. They're a newborn baby who is alive. But then within the first 28 days after birth, they die. And so they're recorded as a neonatal death. So now what we have in Victoria and Queensland is clear evidence that there are some babies who are going in to be killed. They're going in for an abortion, but they survive the abortion, they're born alive, and then they're left to die in those states. They die in hospital and they don't have an equal right to care like any other baby who's born prematurely, who you would do everything you can to either save or make comfortable depending on their circumstances.
That's tragic. Okay, so tell me about so a woman goes in, she gets an abortion very, very late term. So what kind of weeks are we talking about here?
So we are talking after 22 weeks and up until birth. So the oldest healthy baby that I know of that has been killed that way was a 37-weeker in Victoria in 2011. The baby was given an injection of potassium chloride at full term and then delivered stillborn. And the mother, this was not a life-threatening circumstance. So you often hear that slogan, pro-life lies, they don't care if women die. The reality is in a late-term abortion, so 22 weeks and up until 40 weeks, there's no medically necessary reason to kill the child because you can just do an emergency C-section and pull out that baby alive because they're viable and then give care to the mother and then care to the baby in the NICU. So there's no reason ever to do a late-term abortion to save the mother's life or for the mother's physical health. You can just remove the baby through an emergency C-section. And that's what you do with wanted babies. But this oldest baby that was killed was 37 weeks. That's full term. My own son was born at Flinders Hospital at 37 weeks. And when I held him, that was a crystallising moment for me on this issue because he was born the year after, in 2012, the year after I'd found out about this other baby. And I looked at him and held him and, he's a little person with emotions and feelings and connection with me as his mother. But I was looking at him at 37 weeks and, a few minutes old thinking, just down the road in Victoria, a baby was killed that was perfectly healthy with a perfectly healthy mum at this same age and for no reason. And why didn't they just induce that baby alive? Because the mother had to give birth anyway.
Right. So what was the reason that was given for that late term?
So in the Victorian legislation, it allows a baby to be killed right up until birth for a psychosocial reason. This was introduced in 2008, and what it effectively means is that you can kill a baby right up until birth for any reason in Victoria because anything can be a psychosocial reason. So if the mother's had a relationship breakdown or she's got some job stress or maybe she's had to move out of her apartment or maybe she's just anxious, for whatever reason it can be, anything that affects her quality of life, her mental well-being, both socially or psychologically, so her physical and material circumstances, but as well as her mental health, anything can fall under psychosocial. So this was a perfectly healthy baby killed whose mum was physically healthy and the mother has to give birth. And so, to me, it's just sheer madness that this is happening. And again, just like the babies born alive issue, most Australians have no idea about late-term abortion and that it happens.
Could you give me some examples of these late-term abortions? What are some stories and names of babies that stick out for you?
Okay, so I'll tell you about the first name of a baby that I heard, and that was Jessica Jane. So I was travelling to Canberra at about 6 a.m. because I'd just taken on a job for the federal government looking at the migration program, and so that required a lot of early morning travel. And I was looking through trying to, because they don't make it easy, Ali. So I was looking through data, looking through media reports, trying to look at coronial reports, trying to find the stories of these babies just before the plane was about to take off. And I found a coronial report from the Northern Territory in 1998 of the baby Jessica Jane. And as the plane was taking off, I downloaded it. And then in the air, I read this report. And the coroner in that case is Greg Kavanagh. And what he writes will absolutely shock you. So little Jessica Jane, she was about 22, 23 weeks gestation, but her mum had gone in for the abortion, again, for a psychosocial reason. She said, I can't have this baby, I can't cope. I've already got kids. This is going to impact my career. These were the reasons that were given. And so the abortionist said, okay, that's fine. And what he did was he didn't do the potassium chloride injection. They often do this, by the way. An abortionist, Dr. Alicia Broome, gave evidence just last year in Queensland about the fact that this is a common method that they now do. It's quicker and it's cheaper, but it's brutal and it's torturous. Like this is worse than Guantanamo Bay, what we're doing to these babies. And so in Jessica's case, the abortionist gave the mother the first pill, which was meant to kill the baby. It's meant to remove the nourishment and supply for the baby, so starves the baby to death. the mother then takes the second pill about 12 hours later, and that induces labour. And so he said to her, turn up to the hospital when the signs of labour emerge. Now, the mother is expecting to deliver a dead baby, but she comes to the Northern Territory Darwin Hospital and she goes into labour, and Nurse Williams delivers a baby that is very much alive, little Jessica, who comes out wriggling and crying, has amazing APGAR scores. So they do these scores. I know you've had children, when they come out, they straight away do this testing to just check their responsiveness and how their health is. Jessica had great APGAR scores straight after birth. And so Nurse Williams doesn't know what to do, confronted with this live baby. She was never told it could happen because they don't train you on this at medical school. It's hushed up. And she calls the abortionist and says, this baby's alive. What do I do? And the abortionist says, so? And that's in the coroner's report. His response is literally, what? So what? And he says to her, I'll see her when I'm next in. And Nurse Williams hadn't told the abortionist that Jessica was a little girl. So what she took by that was, I'll see the mother when. He had no regard for the baby, this newborn baby that had been delivered alive, who was healthy, nothing wrong with him. And just said, I'll see her when I next come in. So he meant I'll see the mother in a few hours. So Jessica then consulted the guidelines. There was nothing in the guidelines about what to do with this little girl, and except the fact that in the guidelines it actually says explicitly to this day. So people will be listening and thinking, this is 1998, it's now 2025, things will surely have changed, but they haven't. To this day, the Northern Territory guidelines around termination of pregnancy still say that if a live birth follows an abortion, do not give life-sustaining treatment. And so Nurse Williams consults these guidelines and she knows her hands are tied. I mean, some people will listen and I think that she made the wrong call. She really should have intervened to care and save that life for the child. But what she did was follow the guidelines and she put Jessica Jane in an empty room on a metal kidney dish. She wrapped her in a little blanket and left her there. And so Jessica, without food, human touch or affection or comfort, without any kind of water or milk, like just something to help or assist. She was just left there for 80 minutes. So imagine that, this little newborn baby, 80 minutes lying on a metal kidney dish. Nurse Williams checks every 15 minutes, opens the door, yep, she's still alive. And then after 18 minutes, Jessica finally passes away. And it's just the most shocking read. So in this coroner's report, Greg Kavanagh says that this should never happen again, that if a baby survives their abortion, they should have the same rights as any other child who is born in the country. I mean, that surely is what most Australians think. And he actually says, we need to change our guidelines to make it clear that this child has human rights. But, that has not happened. Or what about the story of the unnamed baby at Westmead Hospital? So this baby, Westmead is in New South Wales. This baby, the parents had gone in for the abortion because they discovered at the 20-week scan that the baby had a cardiac issue, so some kind of problem with the heart that was quite serious, a congenital defect, a disability, and they were advised to abort, and they went in for the abortion. Again, like the case of Jessica Jane, this little unnamed baby at Westmead Hospital was born alive. And the parents held this little baby for about an hour. They cuddled the baby, they held her. But then at some point after that first 60 minutes, the chain of custody was lost. And this unnamed baby was found some hours later lying in a medical waste bin, whimpering and struggling to breathe. And no one even knows how long that baby was there, but the coroner's report by Janet Stevenson says it was some hours. And so someone, presumably a health worker, walks by, hears something in the bin and picks up this little baby and is just shocked that there's a full baby in the bin, like with, a face, hands, toes, a body, like they're fully formed and developed. That actually happens at 12 weeks. And all that has to happen after 20 weeks is for that baby to grow, just like you and I were constantly evolving and growing and developing. And so this little baby was a fully formed baby and was just abandoned and discarded like they were just a syringe, amongst all sorts of medical waste in that bin. The health worker then picks up that child, doesn't know what to do. Eventually the baby just gets dumped in the mortuary in the hospital. And Janet Stevenson says there was a total abrogation of responsibility on behalf of the people who were meant to care for that child.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, look, this is challenging what we all believe a hospital even is, that you go there to be cared for, especially these vulnerable babies.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Are these the only two stories
No,
you're
and
aware
then
of?
the most recent one happened just down the road at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. And again, I want to make clear there's not a mandatory coronial inquest. So to find these stories, I had to do a lot of digging. The unnamed baby at Westmead Hospital, that's not publicly available. I got that through a whistleblower. So I got that coroner's report through a whistleblower. And, you know, it is really hard to find these stories. And the third story that I'm about to tell you about, this has not been reported anywhere other than in the media. And it's the story of baby Zantha at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital just down the road. Her parents went in for an abortion to kill baby Zantha at 19 weeks because they found she had Down syndrome. Now, remember, Down syndrome is not a life-threatening condition. In fact, the data shows that these children are often happier and their families are actually happier. Like the siblings are often happier if they've got a sibling with Down syndrome, which, you know, people don't understand or it seems intuitively wrong, but it is actually there quite clearly that, you know, Down syndrome doesn't affect quality of life for the children or even for their families. And these parents did go in for the abortion at 19 weeks at the Royal Brisbane because Zantha had Down syndrome. And then unexpectedly, Zantha was born alive. They didn't do the injection of potassium chloride. They just gave the labour-inducing drugs. And so Zantha is delivered and she's alive. She's wriggling, she's crying. Now, she's pre-viable because the oldest or the youngest baby that has survived in the world is at 20 weeks. So Xantha's before that age, but she's still a baby. She can still feel pain. Her pain sensors and receptors are there, and she knows her mother and her parents' voices. She's responsive to light and sound in the womb. She's tasting what they're tasting. So when she's born, she's a little human person who they then dump on a metal kidney dish in an empty hospital room. So they don't tell the mother or the father that she's been born alive. They dump her in a room and she lies there for 7 minutes without any medical care, without anybody in there, without anybody to even hold her and give her a cuddle. And she just passes in that situation of absolute torture and agony. And the only way we found out about that is later on the mother finds out through an offhand remark of a health worker that Zantha survived the birth. The mother then spirals into suicidal ideation, deep, deep depression, and gets hospitalised and feels completely abandoned by the system. There's an article in the Courier Mail that focuses on how the hospital system failed Xantha's mum, and there's just 2 little paragraphs, a few lines about Zantha and what happened to her, but it's not the focus of the article. And that tells you everything you need to know about the medical and media establishment in this country, in that we don't see these little babies who survive their abortion as people, as babies with human rights.
I'm honestly so deeply shocked and appalled by everything you've just said, and also other bits of information that I've read before doing this interview. I'm going to save some of my thoughts and opinions about this until a bit later, and instead I want to pose a question back to you that I think people who might take a different position on this would ask you. So I'm going to ask you based on them, okay? So one of the questions other people might say is that these late-term abortions only happen in extreme cases, in severe fetal abnormalities, or that there's a risk to the mother's life. Is that true, or is the reality different?
Yeah, so that is the most common myth you will see in the mainstream media and by abortion advocates and apologists, that a late-term abortion only occurs because the baby's going to die or the mother's going to die, and so it needs to happen. Now, to be clear, an abortion that late never needs to occur for the mother's health. The emergency response in a wanted pregnancy, so if I came to the hospital because I've got severe preeclampsia, I'm 22 weeks, or maybe I've been diagnosed with cancer and I need to do chemotherapy, what the medical team would do is do an emergency C-section, and they can get the baby out in a matter of minutes. That's routine medical care for an emergency. Yeah. A late-term abortion, there is no medically necessary reason to do it, and I'll explain why. Because the process for the process for a late-term abortion is feticide. The purpose is to kill the fetus, and so what they do is they sedate the mother, they inject the fetus with potassium chloride or digoxin, a poison, into the baby's heart, and then they deliver that baby dead. Now, that whole process takes between 12 to 48 hours. If the mother was truly in a medical emergency, you wouldn't waste time killing the baby first. Wow. You would just get the baby out through a C-section. Yeah. They don't tell you this.
Wow. Why would they not tell people that?
Because there's an agenda. There is so much money in abortion, and there is an agenda behind this. If we think about, some of the big abortion corporations worldwide, like Planned Parenthood or Marie Stopes International, these are billion-dollar organisations, and they're getting huge amounts of funding. They give money back to these political parties and to the media. There is a massive cover-up on the issue of abortion, and it's not just me saying it. Renata Klein and Janice Redmond, they're pro-abortion scholars who looked at RU486, which is the abortion pill regime that typically occurs to kill first trimester babies. And they are pro-abortion scholars who very much believe in abortion, but they, in their book, show how there's been a massive cover-up, even in the testing via the pharmaceutical company, both in terms of testing these drugs before they hit the market and then afterwards in terms of covering up what they've actually found. And women have died from these abortion drugs. There's a 6% complication rate as opposed to a 1% rate for surgical abortion, and yet governments are pushing these drugs on women. And there's a money trail here that I haven't uncovered, but other people are looking at it. And certainly it's clear that the public is not being told the reality of abortion up to birth in this country. So the first thing was to say it's never necessary for the mother. The second thing to say, is it necessary for the child? So let's imagine a worst case scenario where the child has anencephaly and their brain is not fully developed, it's missing, and so the doctors will turn around and say, we need to do an abortion. Now, mothers are typically told that the baby will be put to sleep and then they deliver their baby sleeping and peacefully, and then they'll hold these babies. And it's called a termination for medical reason, a TFMR, that's what they're told. I've had these comments on my Instagram from women saying, how dare you be against late-term abortion? My baby was born peacefully in my arms. And I haven't actually ever responded to those comments because I can't bring it in myself to tell them the truth. I tell them the truth in my videos, but I don't know how to say it to them. Your baby didn't die peacefully. Your baby was brutally injected with potassium chloride or digoxin at a gestation where they could feel pain, and their heart was burned, and they had a burning sensation that wasn't instantaneous, and they felt excruciating pain. And then you delivered them, you thought they were asleep, but they'd been brutally killed and they were just dead. And that's actually the reality. I haven't been able to write that in a comment in response to these women who write, my baby was born peacefully and how dare you be against this. So even in the worst case scenario of something like anencephaly, my response would be the more humane thing to do would be to deliver the child early and to give the child palliative care so at least they're comfortable and not suffering. And Dr. Melissa Lai, who's a senior neonatologist from Queensland, she speaks about this because she works with these really sick babies, and she says they never feel pain after birth because we make them entirely comfortable. And if they've got anencephaly, they're likely to die a few moments or hours after birth, but they can die, being held or being sung to, hearing their parents, and morphine on the lips to make them comfortable. They don't have to die with their hearts being burned. It's just horrible that women aren't told the truth. And then can I say more about this? The data doesn't bear out the claim that late-term abortions only occur for a medically necessary reason. In South Australia, where I'm from, that's the state which gives the most robust data around reasons for late-term abortions. It's covered up in almost every state. Only Victoria and South Australia give any reason at all. Queensland doesn't, WA, Northern Territory. But in South Australia, abortion up to birth was implemented in July 2022. And what we can see is since that time, there's been 18 months of data released. 80% of late-term abortions kill a healthy baby, so nothing wrong with them, with a physically healthy mum in a non-life-threatening situation. So they've intentionally injected this baby with poison and delivered them stillborn when they could have just delivered that baby alive. And in fact, I introduced a bill working with some politicians last year that said, let's allow women to terminate their pregnancy through all 40 weeks, but after 28 weeks in the third trimester, let's not allow that injection. Let's just allow the baby to be delivered alive. And the pro-abortion establishment went nuts. They There was hit piece after hit piece in the media. I was investigated at work because of all of the activists weaponising my university complaints mechanism against me. I was called in for meetings, and I was banned from the South Australian Parliament on a claim of bullying and harassment. Even though that claim was never formally put, there were no allegations, no opportunity to respond, and no due process. And everything that they said that I did, I have debunked through, because there's video footage of the parliamentary proceedings, and they said that I yelled. I never yelled. I was never kicked out on the night. But then after the fact, because they were so outraged that I would dare introduce a bill that would allow these babies in the third trimester, so 28 weeks to 40, to be delivered alive rather than dead, they have done everything they can to destroy me. And so in the last 18 months in South Australia, 80% of late-term abortions killed healthy babies with mums in non-life-threatening situations. That's 45 healthy babies were killed in this way, completely unnecessary. 12 babies were killed because they had either a confirmed or suspected disability. So that's something that you've got to be really clear on, that people need to be aware of, is that when they do that prenatal testing, it can often be wrong. In fact, I've seen studies that say at least 1 in 2 are wrong. And so they're killing healthy babies without realising it. But of the 12, we don't even know how many had a life-threatening condition like anencephaly, or how many had a cleft lip. I have a very good friend in South Australia whose baby was diagnosed as having a condition incompatible with life at the 20-week scan. The baby was born and the baby just had a cleft lip. So, you know, when they say, oh, well, late-term abortions are needed because to save the mother's life or because the baby's going to die, well, the data does not bear that out. And then South Australia actually has a line item that says how many late-term abortions were needed to save the life of the mother, and the answer is 0. It comes up time and time again as 0 because it is never needed to save the life of the mother.
Okay, because for me, the strongest argument that ever comes from the sort of pro-abortion side is that they giving examples that are usually exceptions to the rule. So what happens if you have a 10-year-old girl raped by her father? What do you do in that case? Now, do you know any statistics around the number of abortions that occur in those kinds of drastic scenarios?
Yeah, so it's less than 1%. And that's not to diminish those circumstances, but that is just to put it in perspective. There's 88,000 abortions every year in Australia, so 88,000 individual babies who are killed through an abortion. Less than 1% of those are for a situation like rape. And so what you'll see the pro-abortion side do is say, we need to have abortion up to birth for any reason, and they'll use the exception to argue the wide, broad, universal justification for it.
Yes. Now, this is a common pattern amongst people who are aware of this term postmodernism, is they'll use intercategoricals to destroy the categories. So, for example, there are no such thing as genders anymore because less than, a quarter of a percent are born with some kind of genital abnormalities that could mean that they're intersex or something. And so because of that reason, now there's no such thing as gender. And so do you think that this is a case where it's a kind of postmodernist attitude towards basically everything, but in this case, abortion, where you have such small numbers of very difficult ethical problems and dilemmas where it relates to, very young girls being raped by their fathers, using that as an instance to then leverage, well, now we need abortions all the time.
Absolutely. That is what is happening. And when you have a debate about abortion up to birth, like we've had in different states across Australia over the last 10 years, time and time again, the case for abortion up to birth is made on the basis of these very extreme examples that are then weaponized in the media. So the pro-abortion side is very good at weaponizing the stories of the victim of sexual assault. They never can tell the stories of the true victims, these 88,000 babies who are killed, because they don't speak and we don't know their stories. And, in the South Australian Parliament on the debate about abortion up to birth, which occurred in 2021, the Attorney General got up and she talked about this 13-year-old girl who had been raped in a situation of incest. And, it is such a tragic story, but it is one example used to justify the 5,000 abortions every year in South Australia. And, a response I will make to people on Instagram when they raise this, or Facebook or TikTok, is just to say, okay, so you really believe that we need abortion in the cases of rape and incest. How about we ban abortion in every circumstance other than that? Would you be okay with that? It would save 87,000 babies, and they invariably, universally turn around and say no. I think, they just, they say, well, there's other really, really tragic, difficult circumstances that women need access to abortion for, and they never ever concede. And that's how you know they're just ideologically driven rather than reasonable people you can have a conversation with. And there's actually a lot of reasonable Australians. I'm finding that through engaging with my content, people are saying to me, you've changed my mind. And I just think maybe one of the biggest issues is Australians just don't know the reality of this, because there is such an extensive cover-up, and because you'll see it time and time again in the mainstream media, the actual lies. So if you Google when is abortion legal in Australia, you'll typically get 24 weeks. That's what Google will tell you. And then if you look at health government sites for different states, they will tell you it's only legal up until 22 weeks. And then the media will repeat that. I was recently on SBS Insight for a program, and they did a data package saying abortion is only available between 16 to 22 weeks in Australia. And on air, it was a pre-record, but I pointed out this is not true. Abortion is available up until birth, and I went through it. But then the SBS Insight team cut that bit where I clarified, and they just left in the lie.
Wow.
And I've been reporting on that on my YouTube channel. I've been exposing that. I put in a complaint to the Ombudsman. I put in an FOI request to get the whole tape, because we filmed for 2 hours, and any piece of evidence that I actually gave, they just cut out from the broadcast.
That's insane.
It is insane.
That's insane. So SBS edited every fact and argument against the opposition, and then left you what? With
so
no
they allowed me to say normative things like abortion kills a human being.
Right.
But they didn't allow me to say things like 80% of late-term abortions kill healthy babies in non-emergency situations. In fact, they kept in the quotes from the pro-abortion activist, Hannah Ferguson, who was on the show. They kept in her lie that late-term abortions are only ever used in medical emergencies, even though I actually corrected that and explained the emergency C-section part. So every aspect where I produced actual information and data, they cut out, but they just allowed me to make these broad motherhood kind of statements. And another example, they had an information package where they said the majority of Australians support the legislation on abortion. I then, in the pre-record, corrected that, and I said, well, the only annual poll that's done that's independent is the Ipsos poll. It polls 1,000 Australians on their attitudes to abortion. It finds that while 74% of Australians identify as pro-choice, that is at 6 weeks. And at 20 weeks, it's only 31% of Australians who support abortion at 20 weeks. Now, the legislation in every state and territory allows abortion up to birth for any reason. So you cannot make the claim that the majority of Australians support the legislation. I said all of that in the pre-record. It was completely cut, and they only aired their lies.
The mainstream media at it again. So they basically just destroyed your argument and put forward their own narrative. Yeah,
which is why I have a YouTube show, like a daily channel, because I now have been showing their clips, my responses. I just feel like this is the only way to get the information out. But then, they will find other ways to weaponise this, even on social media. So, for example, there's a new bill before the New South Wales Parliament that would force all hospitals to provide abortions if the Minister for Health gives them a direction. Now, it hasn't been passed into law, so I'm campaigning against it. And it says that the hospital must comply. Now, I had made the claim on social media that this could lead to the closure of Catholic and Christian hospitals and force faith-based health workers or anti-abortion health workers to perform abortions. That has gone to over 1 million views on my various channels. So the other side then knows, okay, well, we've got to shut it down. Facebook, Meta, has a deal with AAP Fact Check. So I can't even tell you the story without just like my eyes just being like exploding with how insane this is, Ali, because AAP has a deal with AAP Fact Check. And if AAP Fact Check says this is misinformation, then people can't share your post. It has a cover that says this is false. It gets put lower down on the feed, and they start censoring your ability to reach people. So since this dodgy fact check has landed by this 25-year-old journalist, Sophia Tariq, so I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I am a Rhodes Scholar. I'm a professor of law. I take the claims that I make very seriously because I know that my whole career would be at risk. There are so many activists wanting to get me sacked that I have to be 100% correct 100% of the time. Sophia Tariq has no PhD in law, and she did a fact check. She's a 25-year-old journalist who's worked for Crikey, The Guardian, SBS, all of these left-wing media organisations, now at AAP Fact Check. So she cycled through like 4 or 5 jobs in just 12 months. And yet she controls free speech on social media because of this dodgy deal with Meta.
So what is this AAP?
AAP, it's Australian Associated Press. They seem like a really dodgy organisation. They've got about 5,000 followers on socials. So they're not a big media organisation, and yet there's a deal with Meta, and Meta uses them to decide whether something's true or not. And can I tell you about the fact check? Because I did a deep dive on YouTube. They quote 3 pro-abortion experts to say that I am wrong as an anti-abortion expert. So one of the so-called experts they quoted is literally a student, a PhD student in Queensland. She's not published a PhD. She's published journal articles as part of a co-authored team, but she's a student. I supervise PhD students as part of my day job. And so how could they use her as one of the experts? The other 2 experts, one is supportive and done, advanced IVF, so using embryos for human for experimentation. So he's got a vested interest in not seeing an embryo as a human being, and that's Christopher Rudge. And so that he's a lecturer. Again, he's a lecturer. I'm a professor. It's insane that they do this. And then the other person was an academic from UTS. Now she is a professor, but she's written article after article about why we need more abortion access and why faith-based institutions should have to provide abortions because abortion is healthcare. So what AAP Fact Check did, and this is how the censorship in the media works, they get their pro-abortion experts to argue that you are incorrect. They put a big stamp on it that says you are lying, and then Meta uses that to stop people seeing it on Instagram and Facebook.
That's insane.
Australians know so little about the brutal reality of abortion because the cover-up by the media is so extreme. So I'll tell you an example. I did a video on my social media platforms which went to over 1 million people on the issue of abortion. AAP Fact Check, which is this dodgy media organisation, has a secret covert deal with Meta, who owns Instagram and Facebook. This AAP Fact Check, which was a stitch-up, it had 3 pro-abortion experts critiquing the fact that me as an anti-abortion expert was wrong, and and Meta used that fact check to ensure that no one could share my video, that it would go lower down on the feed. And since then, they've curtailed my ability to reach people on the issue of abortion, all because of this dodgy stitch-up by AAP Fact Check that I have no recourse to. So people think that what they're seeing is the truth, when in reality, it is the lies of the pro-abortion establishment that are being actively advanced by their interests in the media. And who even are AAP Fact Check? This fact check was written by a 25-year-old journalist, Sophia Tarak, almost just out of high school, let alone uni, and she's fact-checking the claim of a professor of law and a Rhodes Scholar and saying that it's untrue.
Just insane. Okay, what boggles my mind is that how this could be happening in a civilized Western country like Australia.
The only reason is because people don't know. So people don't realise that every week there's a baby who survives their abortion in this country and is then left to die in a state where they don't have a right under the law to equal treatment, to medical care. You know, people don't know the data, the fact that if a baby survives their abortion, the average survival time is 32 minutes, but they can survive for hours. So in one study in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, one baby survived for 267 minutes. That's 4 hours without medical treatment or medical care or even human touch and contact. In another study, the biggest ever longitudinal study of babies who survived their abortion was a Canadian study. In that study, it found that one baby survived for 24 hours after their abortion. Wow. So these are little babies who are being left to die in the most brutal way, and nobody knows about it. You have to comb through the data for years and years, like I have, to find it. And then even when you try to share it with people, you're getting censored by the media or on social media. And the thing is this, we wouldn't even do this to puppies. To a newborn puppy, there would be a national outcry if we allowed a newborn puppy to be left to die in severe pain without any kind of care or treatment. And yet we do this to human babies straight after birth. We leave them to die in the name of healthcare. As I started to unearth this scandal of babies being left to die in hospitals around the country, I actually got a message from a horticulturalist. So part of my other work as a professor is to do research around vulnerable migrant workers, and I've travelled around and spoken to lots of farmers and workers. Anyway, one of the farmers that I worked with, she sent me a message and said, Joanna, you do realise that calving induction was banned because we realised how inhumane that was for baby calves. So we don't even do this to calves. So a quicker, cheaper, easier method of killing calves after birth is to just induce them alive and leave them to die. But that got banned for baby calves, And yet for newborn babies who survive their abortion, and we do this method because it's quicker and cheaper, because you then don't need to have someone with an obstetric specialist where they can do the ultrasound, find exactly the right spot to do the injection, because if they miss by just a centimetre and they get that injection of poison into the mother as opposed to the baby, it could be fatal for the mother. So it is actually risky. So you need someone who's extremely specialised and skilled to be able to do that kind of intervention, and that costs money. Whereas this cheaper method, which is just barbaric for these babies, not that that's humane, but this is just barbaric. This cheaper method of giving the mother 2 pills, one which is supposedly meant to kill the baby, the other which is meant to induce the baby dead. This cheaper method leaves to these babies surviving and then just being discarded. I interviewed a midwife, Kathy from New South Wales. She'd just retired, so I was able to do this interview without covering up her face, because one of the reasons people can't talk about this is because they would get sacked. This goes against the health policy. So midwives and nurses are curtailed from actually telling the truth and coming forward. Kathy said in her hospital in New South Wales, babies are born alive, they are put in the medical waste room, they are laid out on trays and they're covered with blankets. And or cloths, and every now and again it'll be somebody's job to go in there and lift the cloth to see if the baby's died, and there's just these bodies, these babies who are just discarded there like the trash, and one example of how the lid was blown on this, because I started to realise, look, I'm butting my head up against a brick wall trying to talk about this, sharing the data. What we really need are the stories. And there's such a big cover-up. And I started to speak to some midwives who wanted to tell the stories, but they really felt like they couldn't. But one brave woman is Louise Adsett, and I'd helped design a law that hasn't passed yet, but it's a law for Queensland that says if a baby survives their abortion, they should be treated no differently to any other child born in Queensland. It's a no-brainer, right? There's a parliamentary inquiry, and the good thing about a parliamentary inquiry is you have privilege. So if someone gives evidence to a parliamentary inquiry, there can be no adverse consequence to them in the workplace. That's the law. So Louise Adsett, who's been a midwife of over 14 years, very brave woman, comes to this inquiry and she shares and she says, in my hospital in Queensland, babies are born alive and they survive their abortion and they're left to die. And she breaks down as she tells this story. She says some of them are wriggling and crying for hours, and she talks of a baby who survived for 5 hours in her hospital and was left to die. And then because of Louise's story, another midwife got in contact with me. I told her story on my YouTube channel, but did have to blur up her face and voice. But she told the story of babies in her hospital ward who just get discarded in the waste room, and no one tells their stories. But she also said there was this other little baby at 28 weeks who the injection of potassium chloride happened, the baby was delivered dead, and the midwife held this little baby boy and he was perfect, and she just kissed him on the forehead and said, "I'm so sorry." And that just broke my heart to think of it. These beautiful young women who've gone into this vocational work because they care about babies and mothers, and they're being turned into killers by the system. There is technically a right to conscientiously object, but there is so much pressure placed on them to participate. They're being told that abortion is healthcare, and if that's the mantra, abortion is healthcare. Now, we never unpack what that actually means. What they're really saying is abortion up to birth for any reason is healthcare. And so when a nurse or midwife turns around and says, "I don't want to do it," what she's really saying is, "I'm a health worker who doesn't want to provide healthcare." And that's why it's so difficult for them to exercise their freedom of conscience, and why you have to be so incredibly strong to turn around and say, "I'm not going to participate."
For someone who fiercely believes that abortion is healthcare, what would be your response to them?
I would say healthcare doesn't kill. Healthcare restores, it heals. It does not intentionally and deliberately kill a human being.
But what about the rights of the women in that instance? Because I think that's what they're thinking, the healthcare of the mother.
Yeah. So I would say that the mother has health issues. So it's either physical or mental, but most of the time it's mental. The vast majority of abortions are for a mental health reason. We should deal with the mental health reason rather than killing the baby. Like, taking the baby out is actually going to cause more trauma for the mother. The data is really clear that the rates of depression, anxiety, suicide are much higher in women who go through abortions. And in fact, there's an academic in New Zealand who is a pro-choice academic, but who uncovered all of this. He did all of this qualitative research on women who had abortions. And what he found was that it impacted on them so adversely mental health-wise. But then he was almost hounded out of the academy because he hadn't towed the party line that abortion is healthcare. So
is it an instance where the researchers and the academics who are in this field are so heavily tied into the pockets of the abortion industry and the money that it means that you can't have accurate science?
Yeah, that is absolutely what I think is going on. So I have first-hand experience of this because I published in an area where I haven't contested the dominant orthodoxy of the academy. So when I'm writing about migrant worker exploitation or vulnerable migrants, I never get my journal articles rejected through the peer review process. They get published invariably every single time. I've never had a media hit piece either on that area. And, that's how I became a professor of law. But a couple of years ago with a colleague, we wanted to write an article about the rights of doctors to exercise their conscience and not refer for abortion. And let me tell you, I've never experienced anything like trying to get that through the peer review process. We sent that to 3 Australian journals, one of whom just rejected it out of hand and said, I'm not sending that for peer review, and 2 other journals who then sent it out for peer review. But they're sending it out to pro-abortion scholars in the academy because there aren't any other scholars in the academy by and large, because you just can't get a job or progress through the academy if you're pro-life. I've only started doing this more recently. I would never have got to be a professor by 40 if this was the area that I was researching in. And so you cannot get research that's critical of abortion published in Australia in the academy. You just can't do it. So we did get that article published in a really prestigious journal, but we had to go to the Cambridge Journal of Law to get that published. And even now there are activists who go through everything that I ever write on this area, and they try to convince the journals to unpublish that research or to issue corrections. And last year the university, they'd already investigated me 5 times, but there was this new investigation about the fact that I'd been guilty of research misconduct. The person who initiated that investigation, she literally has a TikTok account about me, daily TikToks about how I'm the professor of misinformation. She doxes my children. She trolls me. Wow. She's a really intense activist, and yet the university took her complaint seriously. Instead of just saying this is ideologically driven, Professor Howe has freedom of academic freedom, they took a complaint, dragged me through an investigation for 3 or 4 months. The investigation found I did nothing wrong. I had not breached the Australian Code for Responsible Research, and the university imposed corrective actions on me. So they said in one breath, you've done nothing wrong, but we're going to penalise you anyway, and this is the penalty. You have to sit through an anti-bias course. I said, no way, because I'm an employment lawyer by background, and I thought this is insane. And I took them to the Fair Work Commission and won, and they had to remove their corrective actions. But you shouldn't have to have that tenacity to dare speak in a way that challenges the pro-abortion consensus in this country. You should have the freedom to research and speak in a way that's critical of abortion, and we don't have that in Australia. What most people don't realise is that in this country, the scientists, the researchers, the people in the academy who are producing the research, they are in cahoots with the abortion establishment, the cartel that has so much money behind it, that is actually being funneled into pro-abortion research through grant programs and through government funding. And that if you dare speak against this establishment, then they will come down on you like a ton of bricks. You will face investigation after investigation, media hit piece after hit piece, and eventually sacked and cancelled because they cannot brook anyone daring to challenge the pro-abortion consensus that they advance.
So essentially, there's no money in just allowing a mother to give birth to the baby, right? But there's money in having the abortion system involved there. And so there's a heavy amount of money there. And if you go against that narrative, you essentially don't have a job at the end of the day. It's kind of like with the health industry. It's like the big pharmaceutical industries might not want to sort of talk about maybe some lifestyle changes that will definitely like improve your cardiovascular disease because there's no money in broccoli or eating better or whatever it is. And so people who go against that grain end up losing their jobs essentially. So that brings me on to this other question, which is, what happens if a doctor or a nurse objects to this? Are they forced to stay silent?
So technically under the law, they have a right to conscientiously object. But I have received so much feedback from women saying that in their workplace, if they say I'm not going to provide the abortion, I don't want to get involved, there's bullying, there's harassment, there's black looks, there's not being put on the roster. So this is the problem. When we define abortion as healthcare and you're a health worker and refuse to do it, then all of a sudden, you're the black sheep. And that's a major problem. But what we are seeing increasingly is that even those really minuscule rights to freedom of conscience that we have are being eroded by an aggressive abortion establishment. So the Greens federally have said that they want to make public hospital funding conditional upon the provision of abortion. That if you're a GP that doesn't want to be involved in abortions, you actually have to actively transfer that patient to someone who will carry out the abortion. And let's just think about this for a minute. That means you are writing out the death warrant of this child. You have to actively transfer. You can't just say to the patient, look, I don't perform abortions. I'm sorry. Here's a list of services. You're going to have to take it from here. Instead, what they want to force you to do is be the person that calls Dr. Death, checks that they can carry out this abortion, and then you literally book their appointment and sign them away. You can't do that if you have a moral position that an abortion kills an innocent human being. You just can't be that involved in the process. It makes you morally complicit, and what it will do is it forces health workers who are against abortion to leave the system and to not be doctors, nurses or midwives. It leads to a homogeneity of the people in the system. Only the activists can exist. But I think what happens is the really radical left pro-abortion activists change this system so much that it just they tilt it to this place where it's so aggressively pro-abortion. And then everybody else, unless they're vehemently anti-abortion because they've looked into it, everybody else sort of just moves over there. Yeah. And over time, we have a health system that we don't even recognise.
That's amazing, actually. It's so true that you have like a loud minority that appear so confident in their views that the majority that don't have time to look into it kind of sway that way. It's kind of like there's something psychopathic about it because narcissists can be extremely confident about their positions, and that's why they can often gather large followings of people and they can easily influence them.
We've seen that in Australia firsthand. So when abortion was legalised in the late 1960s, there was a very strong caveat in the law that said if a baby can survive, so after viability, abortion is not legal. So it's legal up until the point of viability. Fast forward 50 years later, the extreme minority who were arguing for abortion to be legal in the late 1960s, that radical extreme has been arguing now for abortion up to birth for any reason. And they've got us there because everybody in the middle sort of just either was too scared to say anything or just didn't know how to say it. I've spoken to medical professionals who have been traumatised by what they've witnessed, but if they speak up, they'll lose their jobs. This is a system that silences truth to protect an industry that is built on death.
Okay, one of the things that's quite terrifying about diving into the abortion debate and putting this episode up is that there are a lot of feminists out there who believe that this is firmly an issue about women's rights and protecting girls. What would you say to them?
I would say I used to be one of those people that thought that. So when I was at Sydney Uni in my early 20s, I was very much a card-carrying feminist who thought abortion was necessary for women to be equal to men. That was the position I held. And it was only in my early 20s after I was challenged about this. There was actually a guy, we were travelling in a car and the topic of abortion came up and it got very heated and he just kept challenging me to think about this in a way that I'd never thought about before. So things like, under what circumstances is it ever okay to kill a human being? And I was like, well, it's not a human. It's just a fetus, clump of cells. And he was like, well, the way we know what something is by what its parents are. So, a dog has a puppy fetus inside it. And obviously, if the parents are both human, it's a human being. That's a scientific fact. This was getting very uncomfortable. And then I was like, but it's not alive. You're not killing anything that's really alive or conscious. And he said, well, the test of whether something is alive is whether it's growing. And this fetus is developing moment by moment. And, that's also a scientific fact. So it started to get really uncomfortable. And I said, but it's alive, but it's not conscious. And he said, well, that would mean you could kill people with dementia. If the test of whether someone was human or not and you could kill them was that, then, you could say that about someone who's under anaesthetic or someone who's got dementia. All of this was really challenging, but I didn't give it anything away that I thought he was right or that he was getting to me, but I did do my own research. And as I researched this, I realised that every abortion kills a human being. It doesn't matter if the method is sanitised or brutal. In fact, all of the methods we use in Australia are really brutal and violent. and they're excruciating for the child. But even if you could do it in some theoretically pain-free way, it still kills an innocent, unrepeatable individual human being. And I came to this realisation that for women to be equal to men, there had to be a different way other than killing their child. And, you know, I've always been very ambitious with my career. I had a stay-at-home mum, and I think in a way, coming from sort of an Indian background with a stay-at-home mum, I sort of rebelled from that and wanted to have a career. My goal when I was little was to be Prime Minister. I've always been ambitious. And so I guess what I realised is that we had to change societal and workplace structures, corporate structures, to actually enable women to flourish, that women naturally have reproductive potential and capacity. It's what makes us different to men, this ability to gestate a child within us and to give birth. That shouldn't be something that the workplace forces us to neutralise in order to be equal to men. Workplaces need to empower women to be able to do this. And that is what I realised is the authentically feminist response. It's not saying abortion. And of course it's cheaper. And, you know, we saw when Roe v. Wade was overturned, all these tech companies in Silicon Valley pretending to be on the side of women, but really saying, we'll pay for you to get your abortion. So that cost them maybe $1,000, $2,000 for a week off and some flights to get your baby killed. But what the really progressive response would be to give those women 12 months of maternity leave. That would cost them $30,000 to $40,000 to $50,000. They don't want to do that. It is way cheaper to look like you're on the side of women by shoving some money so they can kill their baby. And then you get the woman back full time. You don't get this part-time worker who wants flexible work, who's got childcare, you know, all of that sort of thing that happens when you have a woman who has children. I've had 5 children in 10 years and built my career up as a professor of law. But I've been in an industry, academia is notoriously flexible for academics. And so I've been able to use that. But it has certainly taught me firsthand that the authentically feminist response is not to tell women to kill their child. It's to find ways, even though it's harder, to support them to have children. And then to the other point, the reason you cannot be a feminist and pro-abortion is because around the world there are millions of girls missing because they're girls. So in the country that I'm from, India will have close to 7 million fewer girls being born by 2030 just because of sex-selective abortion. And I know this firsthand. I grew up in a family where the older generation valued my brother and thought that he deserved respect and opportunities, but because I was a little girl, I shouldn't get that. Now, thankfully, I wasn't killed in utero because I was a girl. I spoke to a whistleblower in South Australia who works in mental health, and she told me that she was asked to sign off on a sex-selective abortion. The story was this, Ali. This was an Indian family. She was pregnant with her 4th child. The first 3 were girls, and the husband was pressuring her to have an abortion because this 4th baby was a girl. Now, this happens time and time again across our country in ethnic communities. This psychiatrist refused to sign off on the sex-selective abortion, but somebody else in the hospital did, and that baby girl was killed just because she was a girl, and this happened in Australia. There's a La Trobe University study that looked at there's a La Trobe and in case you think that's just a one-off, there was a La Trobe University study conducted in Victoria that looked at live births in ethnic communities. Now, the ratio should be roughly equal, 1 baby girl born to 1 baby boy. In certain ethnic communities in Victoria, 125 boys are being born to 100 girls.
Whoa.
And that's happening in Australia.
Wow.
And the cover-up is so extensive that when Dr. Mark Hobart, a Victorian doctor, dared turn around to a couple and say, I'm not going to kill your baby and sign off on this abortion because of their gender, he was censored by the medical board because he wouldn't provide a sex-selective abortion.
That's insane. I mean, that turns the entire argument on its head, that the sort of pro-abortion side or pro-choice as they would call themselves are doing it for the rights of women and girls. But I guess you're telling me that abortion indiscriminately targets women and young girls more than boys.
Absolutely. And the real reason for abortions, if we looked at this, what we would see is that the abortion doesn't fix those real reasons. There's a University of Queensland study that was funded by the abortion industry, and I often like to use those studies because then people can't accuse me of bias. So in this UQ study, it looked at the reasons why women had abortions, and 43%, so close to 1 in 2, were victims of violence. Now, what the abortion does is it adds another violence. On top of that, the woman is suffering from a DV situation, presumably, or intimate partner violence. she's then going in for the abortion, which kills her child. And the abortionist, the abortion industry says, oh, we've done it now, we've fixed it. But they send her back to that situation of violence. Doing the abortion doesn't take her out of that situation of violence. It just fixes an immediate problem, but ultimately sends her back to the place where she's trapped. And that tells you something else about the free choice that she's making. Is it really free? If she's in a situation of violence, how freely can she choose to kill her child? Or is there pressure being placed on her by the man in her life? And none of that gets exposed by the abortion cover-up in our country.
I was really surprised when I started getting interested in learning more about the abortion discussion, about the number of abortions that happen every year or in a particular country at a particular time. Can you give us some context to the numbers of abortions that happen? Because I think people are going to be shocked by that.
Since Roe v. Wade in 1973, 63 million babies have been killed by abortion in America alone. That number dwarfs the entire population of Italy. It swamps the numbers of deaths in Stalin's purges, in the Holocaust, in the Rwandan genocide. There is literally no bigger killer worldwide than abortion. In Australia, the government does these charts about the leading causes of deaths in this country, and they put up cardiovascular disease, which kills, a few people every year, like tens of thousands. But the leading cause of death, the close to 100,000 lives lost every year, are little babies in utero through abortion, and that never makes the official statistics.
So if abortion numbers are so high, why is there still a narrative that abortion access is under threat?
It's a complete lie. Abortion has never been more available or accessible than in any other point in human history. Abortion is so accessible in Australia that you can get one by telephone. Through telehealth, you can organise a hit on your baby.
Okay, well, look, one of the other questions I think we're going to get a lot of in the comment section is that a fetus isn't a person because it's dependent on the mother. What would you say to those people?
So I think it begs the question, well, what is personhood? And someone like Peter Singer, who's a so-called ethicist from Princeton, but also the father of abortion up to birth and the Victorian Greens in Australia, he would say personhood is conditional upon consciousness and aspiration. So he has published a journal article which says that, the way you define a person is whether they have objectives and aspirations and dreams for their life, whether they're conscious. That is how you work out whether they're a person or not. The problem with that is, as he acknowledges in this article, well, that means quite a few people with severe disabilities aren't people. They don't meet the definition for personhood. A child up until at least the age of 1.5 is not a person under Peter Singer's definition. What I would say to someone is, what you're essentially saying is that dependence is the condition for personhood, that because a child in utero is dependent on her mother's body for survival, that makes her not a person. But there's plenty of circumstances in our lives as humans, even as adult humans, where we're dependent on others, and that doesn't make us any less human. A newborn baby is entirely dependent on her mother for survival, but you can't kill a newborn baby. To argue that personhood is conditional upon dependence doesn't make any sense. And something I'll often throw back to people who say that would be, okay, so you don't think a baby pre-viability is a person, but what about after viability, where the baby could be induced alive and given care? Could you acknowledge, that would be okay? Or what about if we could take the baby out at any point and place that baby in an artificial womb and gestate them that way? They're not dependent on the mother's body. Would you be okay with not killing that child, not giving the mother the right to kill that child? And they invariably turn around and say no. And I think this is the crux of it. The real argument for abortion is not my body, my choice. It's my baby, my choice. It's this idea that my baby is property and therefore I get to determine what happens with my baby.
Okay, and I think this is really where the crossover happens, is that you have the two sides really arguing past each other, because the pro-choice side, the pro-abortion side, will say my body, my choice, and they're very much focused on the mother's body and the autonomy to make decisions at every stage of the process of pregnancy. And the sort of pro-life side is saying, well, no, that there's another body there, there's another life there, there's another girl potentially there that you're denying the rights to. What have you found to be helpful in fostering a dialogue to bring those over to people, to your side, so they can see your point? Or have you found that there's just an ideological brick wall for you there?
I actually find that if you're speaking to anyone other than an extreme activist on this, you can have a conversation. And what can be really helpful is even to just look at pictures or videos of fetal development and to talk about abortion methods. So when talking to someone who has that my body, my choice position, I will typically start with, let's look at a baby who survives their abortion. They're no longer in the mother's body. Who gets to choose whether that baby has medical care and a right to life at that point? And most people will say, yep, that baby should get care. But then you wind it back and you say, well, what about viability between 23 weeks and birth? What happens there? And you tease out the fact that, well, an abortion method at that point intentionally kills the baby without any benefits to the mother, without any health benefits to the mother. Its sole purpose is to kill the baby. The baby's delivered dead. The mother has to deliver that baby anyway. So you just talk through, well, could we not just deliver that baby alive? And then that's really a litmus test of whether you're dealing with someone reasonable or not. Because if they can see that, yes, you could deliver that baby alive and give that baby care, then they sort of start to unpack that my body, my choice argument. And then you can wind it back and look at between 13 weeks and 22 weeks. The method of abortion there is a dilation and evacuation abortion. It's where the abortionist goes in with metal forceps. So really big scissors that have kind of blunt ends, but they wrench off the leg of the baby and they pull that out, and then they go in and wrench off another leg. They pull that out. They do that with the arm. So imagine your arm being ripped off its socket forcibly at a gestation at a time where you can feel pain. You're pain capable at this point. And they pull out that arm and they crush the torso, and then they pull that out, and then the final step is to go in and crush the skull, and then this white powdery substance appears. That's the method in the second trimester. It's a brutal method, and if you actually sit with someone and have a conversation about what that entails, maybe even show them an animated video, and then you compare that to the development of the child at that gestation, what you'll find is that the my body, my choice argument evaporates for that person. When they actually turn their eyes and look, they can't unhear or unsee what they've come across.
Yeah, I mean, when I've seen some of those animated videos, I think a couple of years ago, that was really one of the things that changed my mind on all of it. Because I think, like you said earlier, I think through a process of osmosis, of being around very loud people who believed in abortion at all stages, I just felt that was the right position to take as a sort of teenager and into my early 20s. And it's not really until you start trying to understand what the process of abortion even is, how it's performed, and understand that it's not just happening sort of within the first week of life, but it's happening right up until 20 weeks or more, that you start realizing that there's an issue. And I kind of felt and believe that for most reasonable people, we're all pro-life at some point. I think I think for a lot of people, it's just, where does that line get drawn? And invariably, if you draw the line at 17 weeks, what about at 16 weeks and 6 days? And then you have to then keep going back until you realize, actually, scientifically speaking, life begins at conception. And that is the scientific understanding of it. And everything after that point becomes an issue of usually convenience for the most part. And what happens is that the arguments around abortion for convenience reasons, and look, I'm not trying to belittle economic reasons or psychosocial reasons that might be legitimate, but inevitably they become convenience issues where you don't want to give that abortion up, give that baby up for adoption, or see how life develops and see what you can do. What ends up happening is that you end up having these intercategorical extreme examples of, like, okay, well, what about a 10-year-old girl who was raped by incest? And then that becomes the leverage to pull everyone over to their side. But as you said earlier, the more you start understanding this, you realize, actually, that's like less than 1%, if that. And when you really get down to it, you say, well, okay, fine, let's put that instance aside where you have that girl who was raped through incest. What about everyone else? And again, you get this ideological challenge where people aren't willing to actually meet you in the middle. And I guess I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about this ideological possession of this, like, fierce right to kill babies, and where you think that's come from, and why people taking this position. What's your feeling on this? Because this feels like it's at the crux of it.
It's really interesting, the origins of the abortion industry. It's actually very dark. So the first wave of feminists, people like Elizabeth Nichols, Susan B. Anthony, they were staunchly pro-life because they realised it would be so damaging to women to have abortion. So first generation who got women the right to vote, to stand in Parliament, they were all pro-life. What happened in the 1950s and 60s is that the feminist movement became captured by the abortion industry. And what we can see is that the founders of big abortion, they had a really sinister agenda. So Margaret Sanger, who's the founder of Planned Parenthood, she wanted abortion to deal with the Negro population. Those are her words. She wanted abortion clinics in black neighbourhoods to kill black babies because she wanted to get rid of the racially diseased.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's the founder of Planned Parenthood.
That's the founder of the biggest abortion corporation in the world.
And how much money are they getting every year?
Oh, look,
It'd be billions.
Yeah, it would be. And I don't know the exact number, but
Okay.
it's billions of dollars. And then the other founder of big abortion, also at this time, was Marie Stopes in a different part of the world, in the UK and in Europe. And she wanted abortion to deal with the hopelessly rotten. She wanted it to rid the society of the worst people who were disabled.
Whoa.
Yeah. So she famously had a child marry someone who was blind, and she just cut them out of her will because she said, how could you marry someone so diseased? I don't want to have them. I don't want to know their children. I don't want their offspring. So the two founders of the biggest abortion businesses in the world, Margaret Sanger and Marie Stopes, were racist, sexist, ableist eugenicists.
And by the sounds of it, some kind of eugenic Darwinian aspect to this, where it's kind of like we want the Übermensch, like the Germans were trying to create this like ultimate breed of Wow, I didn't know any of that.
Yeah, the Nazis were really into abortion.
Really?
Yeah, they wanted to create the ideal person. They experimented on fetuses. There was all of this eugenicist attitude in what they were doing, and in terms of creating the ideal, person.
Okay.
And so this is the dark underbelly that people just don't know. And Planned Parenthood has sort of scrubbed Margaret Sanger from their website. Marie Stopes has rebranded as MSI International because, in this era of, where the scholarship that I was on, the Rhodes Scholarship, has been really tainted by the founder, by Cecil Rhodes and some of his dealings and businesses in slavery, but these big abortion providers, they want to just carry on the legacy of their founders, but without any of the scrutiny about what it's really about.
Yeah. Okay. So when do you think the ideological movement, where do you think the axis turned from this being clearly a sort of racist, sexist, eugenics, sort of even Nazi-based medical experimentation? At what point did it go from that into being this sort of flowery social justice fight for, women and their rights? At what point did the branding change?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that it was around the 1970s with Roe v. Wade. So what we see happening in the 50s and 60s is this push for abortion. Then you get a Supreme Court decision which says you can't have limits on abortion. And then that gets rolled out in the different states in different ways. But you see this abortion rights movement emerge in the 80s, and you see it 100% aligned with this feminist agenda. So, if you think about the 80s and 90s and the power suits, the women taking over the world, the women, talking back to the men and the patriarchy that's oppressed them, and abortion became just a fundamental tenet of that approach. And it was almost like you were anti-woman if you didn't sign up to that. And so then it became really hard to argue about the rights of the child in utero or to argue that there had to be a better way for women because, the media, the universities, the corporates and government, all of this gets captured. And politically, a really powerful force develops through Emily's List. Most people worldwide have no idea of the name of this organisation, and yet it's been so powerful to pushing a pro-abortion agenda in the government. And in Australia, Emily's List was created in 1996. In America, it was in the 1980s. The sole goal of Emily's List is to get pro-abortion women into the Democrats in the US or the Labor Party in Australia. And they have been so tremendously successful, and they've combined it with quotas. So the Australian Labor Party not only has this relationship with Emily's List within it, but they've successfully argued that, 40% of the people in the parliament need to be women. And so that means that 40% of the people in the parliament are typically pro-abortion women who have come up through Emily's List. And that's why Australia has abortion up to birth for any reason in every state or territory, even though the people would not be as extreme as the parliament.
That's insane. Like, that's such a clear example of conflict of interest and a bias that then gets perpetuated into governance.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the Democrats back in the day, there were a lot of Catholics in there. It was not staunchly, aggressively pro-abortion, and yet Kamala was the most pro-abortion candidate we've ever seen for the Democrats. Similarly, in Australia, the Albanese federal government has been the most pro-abortion government we've ever seen. There's literally, Ali, and most people will be shocked to hear this, a late-term abortion payment. So under Australian law, if you have a stillborn baby, you're entitled to about $4,500 from the government, which will just help tide you over in that period dealing with the grief. But the way the Albanese government has structured this is if you have a stillborn baby deliberately, like if you've deliberately killed your child through the injection of poison and delivered them stillborn, you can still get that $4,500. It's a late-term abortion payment that has happened under this government's watch.
So hold on. So effectively, you could run a business as a woman if you want to just get pregnant every 9 months, and then or 20 weeks or whatever, and just keep aborting them, and then you'll get $4,500, whatever you just said it was.
The stillborn parenting payment applies to late-term abortion. You're going to get so much hate for just saying that, but the reality is there's actually there's precedent for this. The Howard government had something called the baby bonus. It gave women $5,000 for having babies. Peter Costello, the treasurer at the time, famously said, have one baby for mum, one for dad, and one for the country, because we had this declining birth rate.
Right.
And women were getting pregnant to get the baby bonus of $5,000. You don't even need to do that now. You can get pregnant for 20 weeks. Kill your baby via a late-term abortion at 21 weeks, and you'll get $4,500. So it's much more lucrative.
No. How is that happening in Australia?
And
That's insane.
how is no one talking about it? I have exposed this, and I've worked with a few journalists. So I went on Sky and I did an interview. I put it on my socials. I managed to get a front page on the Advertiser in Adelaide, $4,500 for a dead baby. So I did get a front page article, but there's radio silence.
And also there's a worry that by talking about this, you're almost promoting it.
Yeah, well, I was worried about that. That people actually got angry at me and said, you should not be talking about this because it's going to lead to more babies being killed.
Because this is the thing. You're a parent, I'm a parent. It's difficult, and there are challenges. And there's as far as I'm aware, basically no incentives to have children. There's no, in terms of from the state. I mean, sure, you get a little bit of help with daycare and stuff like that, but we ought to be incentivizing the creation of families. It's the foundation of the country. It's the foundation of the state. Now, the idea that you're not doing that, but you're instead giving money to parents who are killing their babies, this is unprecedented in the history of civilization. Who does that?
It's absolutely insane, and it's got through because of behind-the-scenes lobbying of pro-abortion activists. So it's only through reading the fine print on the government website and then asking strategic questions that I've uncovered the fact that if you have a late-term abortion, deliberately kill your child and deliver them stillborn, you can get $4,500 from the federal government for doing so.
Can you say anything further about the issue of the conflict of interest on money and how big business is really affecting the abortion discussion and industry?
There's a massive cover-up about where the funds are going. So Australians pay their taxes. They have no idea that those taxes are being used to kill babies in the millions. This is happening because our hard-earned taxes are going to subsidising these abortion drugs. So Renata Klein and Janice Redmond, two pro-abortion scholars, have done all of this research to show that the pharmaceutical companies make millions and billions of dollars from these drugs, from RU486. And we're giving money to the government through our taxes, who are then putting this same money back in the pockets of pharmaceutical companies by heavily subsidising these drugs. So that's one element of the abortion cartel. Another element is through academics doing pro-abortion research that is directly funded by the federal government. So in the last few years, the government has put millions of dollars into two abortion research networks, Sphere and OzCaps, both of which have received direct funding from the government to do research that advances the interests of the abortion industry. In Queensland, we saw that in Premier Miles's office, the most pro-abortion government in Queensland history, literally the number of late-term abortions have doubled in the last 3 years in Queensland. when that same government said they will not increase. If we introduce abortion up to birth, late-term abortions will not increase. And yet 154 babies were killed in 2018. 304 were killed late in pregnancy in 2021. So there's a doubling. In any other field of medicine, that would be a scandal that we would look at. We would say, the numbers of diabetes cases have risen by 50%. We've got to look into that. But here we've got a situation where the number of babies being killed has doubled and no one's talking about it. And in that same government, the head of the abortion activist group, Children by Choice, is subtly working for the Labor Premier's office. There's all of this kind of underground network between the academy, between big abortion business and the government, and they're working together to pursue an aggressively pro-abortion agenda that the Australian people don't want, they don't know about, and they would be shocked if they ever found out.
Can we talk a little bit about what you're really focusing on in your work to stop this? Could you talk about some of the sort of policies that you're changing, laws that you're helping to write? How are you going about doing something about this?
Yeah, so I guess I came to this point in 2021 where I just thought, well, I've spent my academic career researching around vulnerable work. I can't be speaking about vulnerable work without speaking about the most vulnerable people in our society, which is these babies who are being killed in utero. My own home state was introducing abortion up to birth, and I just thought, well, this is career suicide, but I have to do it. And I knew I might never get to professor. I was an associate professor at the time. So I started by posting videos on social media, because when I would do interviews with the mainstream media, they would deliberately censor my voice. So I've talked recently on my YouTube channel about Tori Shepherd, a pro-abortion journalist at The Guardian, and I don't want to call her a journalist. She's an activist. Every article she has ever written about abortion has been from a pro-abortion perspective. She works for a media outlet that has an explicitly pro-abortion editorial policy, but it's in the fine print. So normal people will go to that website and think it's news, that they're getting independent news on abortion, when in reality they are getting an agenda, a pro-abortion agenda. In 2022, Tori Shepherd had asked me some questions, which I responded to by deadline. She knew that I was going to respond, but she published her hit piece on me without any statement from me in it. And when I complained about this, she said, I never got the email. Now, that's not how email works. If she knew I was giving her a response and I told her it was coming and we'd been responding to each other, it doesn't go into your junk mail. I tried to complain to the Guardian readers editor because they're not a member of the Australian Press Council, so you can't even take them to the independent arbiter. The Guardian readers editor wrote me one email back asking me to substantiate their claim, and then I never heard from her again, and that was 2 years ago. There's just so much media bias that I had to go on social media, even though I don't love the medium. I'd never had social media accounts, but I now post daily to Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok and X, because that is a way of reaching people on the issue. Through that work, politicians and legislators have become interested in some of the things that I've been getting out, because most Australians just had no idea about most of these issues. I've helped draft legislation in Queensland, a termination of pregnancy live births amendment bill that says if a baby is born in Queensland after their abortion, they should have an equal right to care and be treated no differently to any other baby. That's an amendment I successfully was able to work with others to get into the South Australian laws in 2021. So we know that it works, and I've been trying to get that through in Queensland. It's remarkable how much the politicians just don't want to deal with this, so both in the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. In fact, the Liberal government here, David Christodoulou as Premier, he passed a ban in December which bans the Parliament over the next 4 years from doing anything on the issue of abortion.
Whoa.
So he's gagged the Parliament from looking at this issue.
He can do that?
I don't think he can. I don't think it's constitutional, but to challenge it, you need a lot of monies. But it's not constitutional, because think about it. Just think about it laterally. Yeah. A government gets in because they've got the numbers. That's how they become the government. They've got the majority. Now, imagine a situation where a government says, I don't want to deal with domestic violence or climate change or wealth distribution or hospitals, and we don't want to deal with it, so we're going to pass a motion which says this Parliament for the next 4 years is not able to address this topic. That's literally what David Christodoulou did in December with no warning. He had never said that he would do that. He said, I'm not going to touch abortion laws, but he had never said, I'm going to proactively pass a motion that prevents anybody else from bringing a law on abortion. So he brings this motion, suspends standing orders, does it by surprise and stealth, and then it's given half an hour for debate, and bam, they've got the numbers. it passes. The Parliament is gagged for the next 4 years. The only way we overturn that is through a constitutional challenge. But what that effectively means is the bill I drafted that says that babies who survive their abortion can get care, that bill lapsed in the last term of Parliament because an election was called. It prevents MP Robbie Katter from the Katter Party from introducing that bill again and trying to get that through.
And all you're trying to do is get care for those babies.
Yeah. Yeah.
It shouldn't be this difficult.
It shouldn't be that difficult. Yeah. And the other bill that I've helped draft is around babies in the third trimester. So if a baby is born prematurely at 28 weeks, they've got a 96% chance of survival. So the odds are really good. This is the third trimester. This is at a gestation where if the mother tastes kale, we can see now that the baby will grimace because they'll be like, that's gross. But if the mother eats carrot, the baby will smile because it's got that sweet taste. And so we've seen that imagery. We know these are babies, like it's really clear. You can't talk about these babies as a clump of cells in that kind of dehumanising way. And the legislation I drafted was to say, and it was a world first, I consulted with scholars all around the world. No one had thought of this idea, but I guess I was trying to think of a compromise. I used to be pro-choice and I was trying to think about it from that perspective. So what they want, if they're pro-choice, is for a woman to have autonomy over her own body, and so to be able to terminate her pregnancy. And I asked the question, why does termination of pregnancy have to involve killing the child? And in that bill, it simply said that after 28 weeks, a mother has a right to terminate a pregnancy, but not to inject her child with poison and deliver the child dead. We would skip the injection and deliver the child alive. After the birth, the mother might change her mind because that is something that happens. The research does show that women who are abortion-minded will change their mind after birth, but equally she might not, and then the baby can be placed for adoption. I would have thought that's a legislation that 99% of people could get behind, but the pro-abortion side was so aggressive about it. They ran a campaign entirely based on lies and misinformation. I think they knew that this might be a slippery slope, that if they allowed this very reasonable thing from 28 weeks to 40, that it could lead to then questions about before 28 weeks. And it's the same thing with the babies born alive issue. I've been really shocked by how aggressively pro-abortion politicians, academics, media outlets and abortion industry advocates have pursued that issue. They are aggressively against giving babies who survive their abortion a right to medical care or equal treatment. And I think, again, it's because they don't want people opening up Pandora's box of realising the horrifically brutal, dirty, dark elements of this abortion industry in our country. And so, if we give a baby after their abortion a right to care, or if we allow a baby in the third trimester to be induced alive rather than dead, then it maybe, starts to enable us to scratch the surface of this very disturbing issue and people wake up. They don't want to scratch the surface because they realise that once we do, we wake up to the fact that 80% of late-term abortions kill healthy babies with mums in non-emergency situations. That all those hysterical, overblown stories of women who have been raped being forced to carry their child, that's less than 1%. That, in fact, the vast majority of abortions are for a mental health reason that we could easily address if we actually address the mental health problem rather than killing the child. But they don't want people to know this because then it's game over for the abortion industry.
Listen, I think we could probably do this for another 3 hours and you'd be continually blowing my mind. And I really hope that people listening, despite whatever side of the fence they're on, can take something huge from this interview, because I think what you're exposing really goes beyond party lines. I think this is a universal issue, which I think at some point we all care about defending the lives of the vulnerable. Now, where can people follow you? Where can people learn more about this story and follow your journey as you go about trying to challenge the status quo on this?
So you can start by looking at my website, drjoannahowe.com/facts will actually take you to fact sheets that you can download and you can look at the references. All of this is very hard to find, all of this data, and it's taken me years and years. I've tried to put some of it there so that you can do this research yourself because I don't expect you to take my word for it, and everything I get is from primary sources, from government reports. If you want to follow me on socials, it's at Dr. Joanna Howe on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok and YouTube. And I do a daily show now, the Dr. Joe Show. It's available on Spotify, Apple, all of your podcast platforms. I'm now trying to do a deeper dive because I'm realizing that the smaller bite-sized content on socials doesn't give people enough. And so I want to take people on a journey, just like I went on a journey on this issue. And then on X, I had a troll take the handle at Dr. Joanna Howe. So I'm actually at Prof. Joanna Howe on X.
Okay. Well, I really hope everyone follows you because I've been following you for a little while now and I've been mind blown and your content is great. So I really encourage my followers to go and follow you as well and catch up with the latest from you. So thanks for coming on the show. Let's make this happen again. Until next time, Godspeed.
Thank you.